Hi everyone, and welcome to Noble Green Wines. Today we're going to start looking at some of the basics, the way wine is made, and that is basically divided into the vineyard and the winery, what we call viticulture and vinification. I don't want to use too many complex words because I want to keep it nice and simple. We can get more complicated as we go along, and the more you sort of want to talk about things or ask us questions, we can go into more detail. I've chosen today to look at 3 French wines from 3 French regions. Now, this isn't because I think that French wines are necessarily better. I don't. It's simply that in the way we're looking at things in the vineyard, it's really handy to look at 3 wineries from 3 different parts of the same country. There's a French word called terroir, which has often got a little bit of a semi-mystical overtone to it, but what it basically boils down to, and it applies to every wine region, is the different aspects of topography, soil, the angle at which the vineyards slope towards the sun or slightly away from, all the different climate and weather, because they're 2 different things. The climate is the general weather you get in an area, whereas the weather is what is more the vintage variation. So the difference between terroir, climate is basically the weather conditions throughout from one year to the next. So if you're sort of in the Mediterranean, it tends to be a lot warmer than if you're in the south of England. The location is one of the most important things. Wine is basically produced in an area between 30 degrees and 50 degrees north, and the same in the south. That band is basically at the very northern end. You get things like champagne, English sparkling wine, very cool climate at the very edge of it. And in the south, I think the south of France, the southern heel of Italy, right down to North Africa, that's about as far south as it gets before it's too hot for the grape really to produce anything of any value. And in the southern hemisphere, you have areas like central Otago in New Zealand, which makes really good cool climate Pinot Noir, and Tasmania, which is producing some really interesting sparkling wines, again at the sort of cooler end of the climate. If you move further south in France, for example, though, you get more red wines, but in the south you get red wines, it's a little bit too hot, so you get more rosé there, where the red wines, the red grapes, get a better ripeness, but they actually make a really nice light rosé. Another important aspect of looking at the location is whether the climate is broadly maritime, which is near to the coast, which has a moderating effect on the temperature, or continental. So, for example, a maritime climate would be somewhere like Bordeaux, where you have a relatively warm summer, but it's moderated by the cooling effects of the Atlantic. And somewhere like the Moselle in Germany, even though it's further north, it has much hotter summers, but freezing cold winters, because you get a huge variation between the two, because you don't have the moderating effect of the ocean. The first wine we're going to try today is, I think, the classic example of the effect of a vineyard and its location on a wine, and that's a Chablis. So it's Chardonnay. The main soil types here, without getting too geeky about it, are Kimmeridgian clay and Portlandian limestone. Portlandian limestone you probably know best as being on the outside of loads of buildings in London, like BBC TV Centre, St Paul's Cathedral. One of the main benefits of this soil type is that it has the unique effect of being both very free draining but also very water retentive. So the vines always have access, except in the very hottest of summers, which you tend not to get that far north, of having regular access to a water supply. So again, it helps with that long, slow ripening. Also, with it being that far north in France, it is relatively cool for wine production. It's only a degree warmer than it is here in London in the Chablis region. And the grapes just about reach a level of ripeness that's acceptable, but they retain this really steely acidity. So if you want to try the first wine with me now. What we have with this one is a lovely green gauge character, a lovely green apple character, and that's all from the grapes are ripe in the same way a green apple is ripe, but they don't get that sort of full-on ripeness that you'd have somewhere like California, for example, where Chardonnay is also grown a great deal. It's got lovely minerality, lovely freshness. And it's got really, really high acidity. Chablis, along with Champagne, which is coincidentally grown just up the road, it's got really high levels of acidity in it, which is absolutely magic in this wine. Chablis is one of the longest lived wines in the world. The high levels of acidity in this wine also mean that it can age really well. Even a Petit Chablis like this from Domaine Motte is capable of aging good 4 or 5 years if you wanted to develop slightly more honeyed notes. They're among the longest lived white wines available. A Grand Cru Chablis can easily do 30 or 40 years from a good vintage, and it really, as Chardonnay does, it puts on weight and really develops over that time into one of the world's greatest wines. And Chablis, compared to other Burgundies, are actually really good value. A Grand Cru Chablis is roughly half the price of a Grand Cru from anywhere else in Burgundy. This Petit Chablis, I think, would work, like any Chablis, really well with seafood, particularly crustaceans, fruits de mer, as you'd find in many cafes and restaurants all over France. One of the reasons for that, and I don't think it's a direct cause, but the Kimmeridgian clay and limestone, the subsoils, are actually full of fossilised crustaceans. Now that forms the structure of the soil, but it's a weird coincidence that the wine actually has a slight oyster shell taste, and I think it works really well with oysters or any seafood, and it's a classic seafood wine. So as we now move a bit further south, we're going to the southeast, to the Ardeche, which is fairly near to the Mediterranean, slightly mountainous, a little bit elevated, but much, much warmer than Chablis. So here we've got an example from Louis Latour, which is unoaked, so it's giving a fair comparison with the Chablis, so nothing else has been done to it other than the vineyard location and the level of ripeness in the wine. So if we give this a taste now. Already I can see in the glass, if you want to hold them both together, preferably over a white background, you can see there's a little bit more depth of colour in the Chardonnay from the south of France. Now, this is not from any other influence other than the ripeness of the grapes and a tiny bit of extraction of colour from the grape skins. So with this already, I'm getting a lot more sort of tropical fruit, a little bit of passion fruit, mango. Nothing too much, it's not a Gewürztraminer in its sort of level of ripeness, but it's got a little bit more red apple, I suppose, is one way of putting it, rather than a green apple. You've just got the same flavours, but just that little bit more ripeness in there. The other thing it's also got is decent acidity, if you want to give the wine a taste now. Now you may notice after the Chablis, it doesn't taste quite as acid. It's still there. If you lean your mouth slightly forward, your mouth will start to water. It's definitely got what we call good acidity, but nothing like the level of the Chablis. The reason I say good acidity is because if a wine lacks acidity, it's what we term flabby, because it literally has nothing holding it together. Go back to the Chablis and try that again, and go back to the Ardèche and just notice the difference in that one aspect of it. And that is simply because of this having had more sunshine hours, so the grapes have reached a greater degree of ripeness. And as the ripeness increases, the acidity decreases in the grape before it's picked. Really good wine, perfect. Both of these would work really well with seafood. For me, because of the lack of oak, it's the one thing I find doesn't work with many crustaceans. The Grand Ardèche, although it's a classic food wine, I think it would work really well with seafood, but it could actually go with sort of slightly richer chicken dishes and that kind of thing. I think it's just a very versatile wine, perfect for drinking on its own. But that lack of oak just gives it, for me, a sort of cleanness, which makes it a very versatile food wine. For the third wine we're doing, we're moving west over to the Atlantic coast, just inland to Bordeaux, probably the most famous wine region in the world. It's broadly divided into two areas. There's a huge river estuary that comes in, the Gironde, and it's broadly divided into left bank wines and right bank wines. The left bank, particularly closer to the river, has quite deep gravel beds that have really good drainage, which Cabernet Sauvignon loves. It loves having good drainage. And it flowers relatively early and ripens early, so having that drainage means the soils warm up a lot quicker, and it really suits the Cabernet grape really well. And on the right bank, it is predominantly clay soils. Now clay is quite slow to warm up in the spring because it's wet, claggy. If anyone has clay soil, they know what it's like. But happily, Merlot flowers up to 2 weeks later than Cabernet Sauvignon, so by that time the soils have warmed up a little bit and the grape has time to catch up, and you get the same sort of ripening period, but over it's like 2 weeks slightly later. Now that is very sort of cut and dried. In reality, there's pockets of clay on the left bank, there's gravel soils on the right bank, and both grapevines are planted in both areas. The thing that is mostly done with it being a relatively marginal climate is that it's more of an insurance policy. They plant both grape varieties because some always do better than others in different vintages. Here we have an example from the left bank. So this is near Ardhe, which is named for the gravel soils in the area. So you've got that lovely free draining soil. It's roughly 50-50 Merlot and Cabernet, the two main varieties of the region. And give it a little pour. As you can already see from the colour, it is definitely a medium-bodied wine. It's got a medium colour, a little bit of purple on the rim. It's relatively young for a Bordeaux, 2015. On the nose, it's got a lovely fruit character, not overtly fruity. You don't get any of those sort of jammy fruits that you might get from California or Chile, where you've got the warmer climate, and people might decide to pick a little later because they want that slightly fruitier character to it. It's a lovely medium-bodied character. So on the nose, I'm getting lots of sort of mulberry, raspberry, a little bit of oak. We'll come on to that in the next session, but there's a little bit of oak influence in there as well. And on the palate, good acidity. This is still a relatively cool area. Don't forget you've got that moderating influence of the Atlantic Ocean. A little bit of tannin, not too much considering it's a left bank wine. There's a lot of Cabernet in there, but just a little bit of grippy tannins. We call them grippy because they literally grip onto your tongue. Tannins, not to get too geeky about it, are proteins, and they tend to latch onto other proteins, which is why when you have red wine with cheese, particularly if it's quite a tannic red wine, with cheese or red meat, it literally softens in the mouth because the wine is gripping on to the proteins in the meat and the cheese rather than on your tongue and drying it out. This, I think, being the wine it is, would work really well with red meat of any kind. I'm not talking about sort of ribeye steak on the barbie, that's more sort of Shiraz territory. I think this is a classic food wine that would work well with most sort of casseroles, duck à l'orange, all those sort of things. And it's a really versatile wine. The oak in there that gives it a little smoky spice on the finish we will look at next time when the grapes are picked and we move into the winery.